Hello, I'm Jeremy Fernandez. Coming up on the virus, the Prime Minister commits $1.7 billion to securing Australia's supplies for 2 potential vaccines, but one of them has now suffered a setback. Plus, the Queensland Premier sparks a backlash over a decision to deny a woman in quarantine the right to attend her father's funeral. But first, Victoria has a roadmap to recovery. A 4-stage plan out of lockdown was laid out by Daniel Andrews at the weekend. Getting from one stage to the next will require a significant and sustained fall in case numbers in the Victorian community. Even then, it'll take until the end of November to get the final stage and the sort of lifestyle the rest of the nation has come to experience as the new normal.
First step is next Monday, when the curfew will start an hour later. Outdoor activity will be allowed with one other person for up to 2 hours. Playgrounds can reopen, and people living alone will be allowed to have one nominated visitor. Government-commissioned modelling shows a 64% chance of a third wave if Victoria opened up in 2 weeks' time.
We need to find that sweet spot between the length of the current lockdown and the risk of resurgence.
By the end of the month, if the average daily new cases drops below 50, Melbourne can take the second step. It includes public gatherings of up to 5 people from 2 different households, childcare reopening, and restrictions will also be eased for some industries, including construction and manufacturing.
There are about 101,000 workers who can come back into the workforce. They currently can't work.
2 days after the Gabba hosts the grand final, and if the daily average new cases drops to less than 5 over 2 weeks, Melbourne can take the third step. Curfew would be scrapped and stay-at-home orders would be lifted, meaning people could leave their 5-kilometre zone. Outdoor public gatherings would increase to 10 people, and there'd be home visits for up to 5 people in a new household bubble. There'll also be the potential staged return of other grades to the classroom. If no new cases are recorded for 14 days by November 23, Melbourne can take a final step. With public gatherings of up to 50 people, 20 visitors at the home, some indoor dining and drinking at pubs and restaurants. As for masks, they'll continue to be part of the measures. Regional Victoria will skip the extended stage 4 lockdown and is on a fast-tracked path out of restrictions, going straight to the second step on September 13. And if there's an average of 5 cases or less recorded over 2 weeks, then hospitality, larger gatherings, travel to other regional areas and local sport for adults could be allowed.
The plight of a woman grieving the death of her father erupted into an extraordinary political row during this week. The Prime Minister intervened, causing Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk to accuse him of being part of a coordinated campaign against her. The woman had wanted to be with her family, but under Queensland's strict coronavirus restrictions, she was not allowed out of hotel quarantine to attend the funeral. She had travelled from Canberra, and Queensland considers the ACT to be a COVID-19 hotspot, even though it hasn't had a case for months.
So although I understand the enormous toll this is taking on people who are coming here to Queensland to attend a funeral of a loved one, whether that be a relative or a friend, they can't do that until they've been in quarantine for 14 days.
Meanwhile, the Northern Territory will open its borders to residents from Greater Sydney in 4 weeks. Currently, anyone who travels to the Northern Territory and has recently spent time in Sydney has to undergo 2 weeks of supervised quarantine. The government plans to revoke that requirement from the 9th of October.
We are deliberately waiting another 4 weeks, 2 full replication cycles, so we can keep seeing the trend go down. A 4-week buffer gives Sydney more time to keep beating the virus, and it gives us the time and flexibility we need to change our plan if necessary. This is the same cautious approach we took with our borders the first time round, and it worked. When we were told to open the borders straight away, we said no. And when things got worse in Victoria and Sydney, we kept them closed. We cannot predict the future, but we can plan for it.
The federal government has signed a $1.7 billion deal with pharmaceutical companies to secure enough COVID-19 vaccinations for all Australians. Vulnerable people and frontline healthcare workers will be first in line for the treatment. If the trials by the University of Oxford and University of Queensland are successful, the majority of the doses will be made locally. The rollout would take place next year, and excess vaccines will be donated or sold to other countries.
Today we take another significant step to protect the health of Australians against the coronavirus pandemic. A $1.7 billion agreement for the supply and production of more than 80 million vaccine doses. It is giving us the capacity to not just produce the vaccine here in Australia, and that is the AstraZeneca vaccine, through CSL, but also to develop and produce the University of Queensland vaccine.
There has been a bit of a bump in the road. 2 days after the Prime Minister made that announcement, there was news from the UK that trials of the AstraZeneca and Oxford University vaccine have been put on hold after a volunteer developed a serious suspected side effect.
On hold, AstraZeneca pauses its coronavirus vaccine trial.
It was news that came out of the blue.
A setback for one of late-stage vaccine trials.
Large safety trials of the world's most promising COVID-19 vaccine temporarily put on hold after a volunteer developed a potentially unexplained illness.
It's often something which requires hospitalisation, requires expert review to determine whether or not it might have been caused by the vaccine.
Experts say it's believed a volunteer in the trial of the Oxford University vaccine may have developed an inflammatory condition.
The information that we have so far is that it may have been a condition called transverse myelitis, which is basically an inflammatory syndrome that affects the spinal cord and is sometimes caused by viral infection.
It's not yet clear whether the volunteer was receiving the COVID-19 vaccine or a placebo. In this trial, the placebo is actually another vaccine to protect against sepsis. It's given so all participants experience the effects of a real vaccine.
It's not implausible to suggest that transverse myelitis in this case has been caused by the placebo.
While phase 1 and 2 trials are done on smaller numbers of people, phase 3 trials are vital because of their scale. By giving the vaccine or a placebo to 50,000 people in a number of countries, experts will get a really good idea how safe it is before it can be widely distributed.
These automatic pauses, because of serious adverse events, do happen as sort of a matter of course during vaccine trials.
An independent committee will now look at the data in detail before deciding when to resume the trial. Sophie Scott, ABC News.
So, for more on these vaccines and what the suspension of that AstraZeneca trial means, I spoke with the Director of the National Centre for Immunisation Research and Surveillance, Professor Christine McCartney. Professor, the Oxford AstraZeneca trial was paused this week. How much of a setback is that?
It may well not be a setback at all. It's not unusual for large phase 3 clinical trials to be paused. And we'll just need to wait and see what further information is forthcoming around that pause. There are a lot of checks and balances built into clinical trials, flags for the need to slow down, take a look at where the trial's up to, if indeed adverse events are occurring. And this is part of a normal and really robust process that we have as part of clinical trial work.
So it doesn't necessarily mean that this project is completely off the rails?
Absolutely not at all. I think everyone would appreciate that when you run a very large clinical trial in say, 30,000 people, by chance, people will become ill, at any time in the course of that trial. Of course, we have vaccine recipients and we have placebo or control injection recipients. And either of those groups, there may be new illnesses. If there's a flag around the number of illnesses or the type of illnesses, that may need a little pause to then investigate further. But it's not a sign that anything is necessarily wrong, just that the right processes are being followed.
What does this pause mean for the timeline of the development and rollout of this vaccine in the longer term?
Well, again, I think it's a bit early to say. The pause is still in place and it may only be a few days. In my experience, those pauses often aren't very long and it may have no impact on the timelines at all. But of course, we don't know what the future holds for any of the vaccines yet in phase 3 studies. That is why we are doing, or the world is conducting these huge studies, now 9 vaccines in clinical trials in what are adding up now to be hundreds of thousands of people. These trials are designed to show if the vaccine is safe and to show if it protects against COVID-19. We have to wait as patiently in these difficult times as we possibly can for the results of these trials to come out.
We're seeing governments around the world throwing a lot of money at the development of vaccine candidates. How would you describe Australia's position right now?
Oh, look, I think there have been a lot of announcements from Australia, and certainly the commitment to see, onshore manufacturing of 2 vaccine candidates should they turn out to be, efficacious and safe in ongoing clinical trials. And that's really important across the world. The capability for manufacturing, for supply and distribution needs to step up. And I think we're hearing that that's happening in Australia, which is great news, and happening in many other parts of the world.
We're hearing that a lot of countries are sort of going their own way, developing their own. What happens if any country, if Australia, backs a vaccine that isn't ultimately successful?
Well, I think the whole framework of developing vaccines here, many credible groups have indicated how important it is to follow the pathway, start with many, many different vaccine candidates. There are around 150 vaccine candidates now, and a number of these won't get past the early phase clinical studies. So it's very important that the whole world doesn't put all of its eggs in the one basket, but equally that those candidates that are looking really promising and getting into phase 3 trials, that there's a commitment to manufacturing those, to getting enough vials, needles, syringes, transportation, everything that's going to be needed to distribute those vaccines, then the monitoring mechanisms to ensure that they're safe. And Australia, along with so many other countries, are pitching in to do this. The level of cooperation has been absolutely incredible. I mean, we've never, as a globe, faced any vaccine program of this size in what is a very ambitious time frame. But likewise, what we've achieved so far as a scientific community, the whole world, everyone who's been part of this endeavour across all of these vaccine candidates so far, it surprised me. I've been astounded by how much progress has been made so far, and it is something that I'm excited about, that we actually will have a vaccine.
There is some concern about this idea of vaccine nationalism, isn't there? Particularly, when we talk about equity of access to vaccine between richer and poorer countries. How do we get around that in the longer term, do you think?
Well, some really important initiatives in that regard. So there is the COVAX. It's like a fund. It's called an advanced market commitment. And this is a very big fund that is, it's got about 3 levels of engagement, but certainly includes the WHO, the Global Alliance on Vaccines and Immunisation, UNICEF, CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovations, all of these very large stakeholders. And they're asking for commitments from countries to be able to provide vaccines to low and middle income countries at either low or no cost, countries that might otherwise have difficulty purchasing vaccine themselves. Importantly, Australia has announced a contribution to the COVAX fund, and many other countries are doing so right now. So this is one important way that the world is really trying to ensure that there is equitable supply and access to really the whole of the globe's population.
I'm sure you're all too aware of the number of people, not just in Australia but around the world, who are suspicious about vaccines. Does that pose a longer-term risk when a vaccine, if and when a vaccine is developed, that the take-up rate just won't be adequate?
Look, people are very justified in having questions and wanting information about vaccines, and whether that's the immunisation schedule for their young child when they're a new parent, whether it's the vaccine that their grandparents are receiving every year to protect against influenza or against pneumonia. It is very appropriate that we have questions and we want to understand about vaccines, and the same goes for COVID vaccines. So it's really again up to us a community, and I do mean here, really the broader health sector and, anyone involved in vaccine programs, to make sure that we build public trust through a lot of transparency, demonstrating, in fact, all of the rigour that goes into developing and ensuring vaccines are safe and effective before they're licensed, and then monitoring them, of course, once they're being used across the globe. So I think those of us who've worked in vaccines for decades, we know how important that is. It's obviously not always able to be perfect, but I think when you have that community engagement, when you have that public trust, and it's built on transparency, credibility, things go well. And in Australia, we have really high vaccination coverage rates. We have parents taking their children to have receive vaccines, and we have a lot of public trust, and we have a lot of belief in broadly in the scientific community here. And the task ahead of us is to ensure we maintain that as we move forward to look even more closely at COVID-19 vaccines.
Professor McCartney, it's so good to have you on the program. Thanks so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
Let's take a look overseas now. Coronavirus cases are surging in continental Europe. Spain has become the first Western European country to have more than 500,000 infections. The death rate is still relatively low in the country, with more cases being recorded among young people who are often asymptomatic. Concerns have also risen over a climb in the number of cases in France, with the nation reporting an increase of more than 7,000 new infections on Sunday. Britain has recorded nearly 3,000 cases for the second straight day. The surge is taking place as many students across the continent go back to school. When Melbourne's Stage 4 lockdown began 5 weeks ago, the ABC invited Melburnians to take part in a special project. They were asked to make video diaries, recording their experiences of daily life during this unprecedented time. From 11-year-olds to those in their 80s, they've shared tales of fear and resilience, hardship and hope.
In the first days of Stage 4, the reality of lockdown hit hard.
I had a really strong emotional response to it. I felt overwhelmed and really down.
I'm feeling worried that the 6-week lockdown isn't going to be enough.
In week 2, that worry seemed justified.
There's an additional 17 fatalities since our last update.
Numbers were still high, so was anxiety.
There's always someone without a mask. There's always someone that's doing something stupid. And it's just like, do you have any idea what we're going through?
Hundreds of thousands of students were also struggling to adjust.
I am really moody. Like at one moment I'll be cranky and then I'll be sad and then I'll be cranky again and then I'll be happy.
I know that for me and for a lot of other Year 12 students, finding the motivation to study by ourselves has been a real struggle.
By week 3, the mental health toll of lockdown was showing up in the number of calls to Beyond Blue's coronavirus hotline. 3/4 came from Victoria.
They are anxious, they are frightened, they are angry, and you can feel it in the air wherever you go.
While many found this lockdown much harder than the first, some families found silver linings.
That's what I want to do, just balance like that.
What we found that really worked was to actually put time aside for the kids rather than trying to juggle work and caring for the kids at the same time.
So much food.
More recently, as numbers dropped into double figures, people began allowing themselves to think about life after lockdown and how the experience has changed them.
I don't think that the world is ever really going to go back to the way that it was. And mostly I'm worried about the fact that I don't know what the world's going to be like.
I think that our lives will never be the same. Everyone's going to be different when we go back. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, we're yet to find out, but our lives, they've been changed by this event. I call it BC and AC. Instead of before Christ, it's before COVID and after COVID. I'm hoping AC will come soon.
Fingers crossed we're all out of this very soon. That is the program for this week. Thanks for your company. I'm Jeremy Fernandez. Don't forget, there's more online, including some of your key questions through ABC iView and the ABC Listen app. Bye for now.